I think we're going to war for real.
I'll tell you one little story that I probably have never told anybody before.
We got hit with a NVA sapper company supported by infantry.
It's not easy, and that one was tough, but fortunately it worked out for us.
Welcome to War Stories, conversational military history. All right, what's going on, everyone? Preston, Stewart, and Sayre Payne with War Stories, joined today by Henry Sledge. Henry, thank you so much for taking the time, sir.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. I appreciate you guys inviting me.
Yeah, so I met Henry a few weeks ago on his podcast called What's a Scuttlebutt? And I'll just start out with a little embarrassing move on my part. He was talking about his interest in the Pacific Theater. He introduced himself, Henry Sledge, and I thought, that's weird. I've only ever heard that last name one time before, and it's on a book on my bookshelf. Talked about his dad being in the war. He mentioned his dad's writings. He talked about Peleliu. And it wasn't until we got off the call that I made the connection that your dad was Eugene Sledge. So most people probably would have gotten there faster than I did.
Well, not necessarily, but hey, man, you had the book on your shelf, so that was cool.
I was starting to get this out earlier. My brother gave it to me a few years ago, and he
that's the first edition.
He intentionally got one that's beat up a little bit. So I like it. That's awesome. So anyways, we reached out to Henry just because he was talking about more and more interest in the Pacific Theater, and that's just not something we've spent a lot of time on, not for any good reason. Honestly, the more I get into World War II, the more interesting that theater becomes, just because it's so unique in so many ways. But is that something you spent more time on than anywhere else, would you say?
I would probably say so, but growing up, I mean, my brother and I were kind of bred to have an inherent interest in World War II history. There was this huge time life pictorial history of World War II, and I remember sitting in my dad's study as a kid while he was writing something on yellow legal pads, and I was fascinated looking through the pictures. And I mean, this thing was a massive history of the entire war. Okay, so it covered all theaters. And, obviously at that age, I'm not concerned with the larger geopolitical questions of why did we fight World War II? I'm looking at the tanks and the airplanes and the equipment that the guys carried. And I knew where my dad had been, and I would ask him questions. And he was a really, a lot of people say that they had relatives in World War II or in the Pacific, but they never would talk about it. And I certainly understand that concept and I respect it. I can't identify with that personally because my father was a very loquacious man. He talked about it a lot. And so, honestly, a lot of the stories that people are familiar with now because of With the Old Breed and then the Pacific miniseries, I mean, I grew up hearing those stories as a kid.
That's awesome. I have heard just folks say that veterans of the Pacific are more hesitant to have shared their experiences just due to the nature of that fighting. And it's really, it's really cool if you think about it. Some of the work your dad did specifically, but some of his friends and other veterans, what they wrote down are now the thing people turn to learn about that conflict. And at the time, they weren't, anything special. They were another soldier, another Marine. But because they were willing to document some of that, it's made a big difference.
Yeah, one of the first and a classic book, and it was one of the source books for the Pacific miniseries, was Robert Leckie's Helmet for My Pillow. I love that book. It was one of the first, when I became an adolescent, my dad handed me his copy that he had made notes in, because Helmet for My Pillow was published in 1957. And I remember being, 12, 13 years old, and my dad handed me his copy of it that he had made notes in, because he was literally mentally prepping himself, comparing that experience. Of course, Leckie was at Guadalcanal, then Cape Gloucester, and then landed at Peleliu and was wounded pretty early on. And then my dad got in theater. They were on Pavuvu at the same time when the 1st Marine Division was prepping for Peleliu. And then, of course, my father went all the way through Peleliu and then Okinawa in 45. But yeah, I read Helmet for My Pillow, as an adolescent, and I love that book. I reread it a few years ago. I'm probably going to reread it here in a year. I handed my copy of it that I have to my 13-year-old. I wish I could say that he's reading it now. I think he's got his mind on other things right now.
He'll get there.
Yeah, we'll get
Sure.
there. We're going to get him there. Probably won't have him read my dad's book for a couple of years yet. But anyway,
Why? Why would you have him wait on reading your dad's book?
there are a lot of parts of it that I think would be great for him. There are parts of it especially when you get to Okinawa, that are just really borderline mentally disturbing. And I don't say that to dissuade people from reading it, but and I'm really researching some portions of my father's unpublished manuscript now. And he goes into even more detail in that stuff. But what got lifted from that and published with the Old Breed, when they're down near Half Moon Hill, making the big push down south toward Kanishi Ridge, and it's raining, it's muddy, he says it reminded him of what he had read about as a kid, the mud-torn, shell ripped apart mud fields of Flanders in World War I. And that's what looking out over this moonscape that looked like a garbage dump and stunk like a garbage dump from all the dead bodies. And they're dug in, it's raining, it's chilly, it's about 60 degrees. And they're in these positions, then they would advance and then have to retreat a little ways and then advance again into previously occupied positions. And they would see Marines that were not able to be evacuated, which Marines always took their dead and their wounded. But there were times on Okinawa when there was some contested territory that the fighting would sway back and forth, and they were unable to do that for several days. And, there's one part, to answer your question, Preston, there's a part, and it really, to read it as an adult, I find it so compelling, and I will use the term poetically moving, but it's horrific. And my dad looks over the edge of his foxhole down a little ridge about 10 feet deep into a mud field, and there's a dead Marine BAR man who my father describes his equipment, and he could tell he was a late replacement, didn't have any, had probably just been brought up and thrust into the front lines as they're making their big push down south. And this guy had been killed by an early shell hit, and he's lying back in his foxhole, and he'd been there for a couple of weeks, and he is literally decomposing before their very eyes. And he still has his helmet on with the cloth, the camouflage helmet cover that the Marines had, his entire uniform, his hands are starting to rot away, still clutching his BAR. And the face is literally half rotted away. And my father, he's in his foxhole, he and Snafu, his fellow 60mm mortarman, and it's raining, and he just looks over and sees this guy day after day. And the raindrops are just dancing around him, and it becomes almost this psychotic nightmare. I mean,
sure,
the way my father wrote about it, he literally began, and you got to think about it, guys, and you guys are combat vets, okay? What just sleep deprivation. I don't, I've never been in the military, okay? So, but day after day after day of sleep deprivation, mentally exhausting trauma, that's what they were going through. And so he literally began to have hallucinations. And the way he describes this in that portion on Okinawa, and there were other portions of it too, is really powerful and moving. I'll be honest with you, I read it to this day and I still almost get choked up. But it's something, I mean, obviously my son, it is his legacy. He will read it. I just, at age 13, I'm not sure I'm ready for him to yet.
Gotcha.
And there were other parts on Okinawa, because it did, he was in combat on Peleliu for 32 days. On Okinawa, he was in combat for 82 days. And so the mental exhaustion was drawn out over a longer period, if that's a good way to put it. And, at night, the ships offshore would fire star shells to light up the area to suppress Jap infiltration, which the Japanese were horrifically effective at doing at night. And, my dad writes, and you've read his book, this, he writes of being so mentally exhausted that he would literally begin to, he would have these half dreams of dead Marines getting up out of their foxholes and coming towards him, you know, with their arms outstretched, and he would just see their lips moving. And it was like they were asking for help, but he felt in his nightmare, he felt powerless to help them. And then he would jerk awake, you know, and realize it was a dream. But I just don't know that I want to have my son exposed to that quite yet.
I think that's what makes that book so powerful, because it is it's the realism of it, and it's not the glorification of war at all, right? Like the impact
Certainly.
of the fact that, well, just the main premise that he was there. It wasn't a secondhand account. I mean, it was his personal involvement. And even like, let's say like Band of Brothers, it's another popular World War II book. It's still probably, most of it is real positive if you think about it, and that experience of all those guys going through that. But then your dad's experience is like being in Bastogne the whole time almost,
Right.
and how it's not fun, it's not enjoyable, but it's also real and it's true. You know, it's not just Rambo winning the day and stuff, where it's real easy to be captivated by that sort of thing as a young person, and reading about American history and all that. And the fact that this is out there as what happened in real life to real people, and it's also like, that is what it is, right? And that's why we don't want to do those things. And so to tell that story and to have him have that perspective of World War I and what they had to endure, and then what he had to endure. And I know just myself as a contemporary person, like I like reading those sort of things to give me perspective when I was over there, like, well, this isn't so bad, right? This isn't the Pacific. I would think about that, like, or this isn't Bastogne. I'm not freezing my balls off in Bastogne being shelled, or in the trenches of World War I. Because I do think it's like there are certain things that are just a horrible war experience. Not that any of them are great, but I think that some are way worse than others. And it's like, I think trenches that you're describing, you know, those muddy shelled out trenches of World War I. And I think being in the Pacific is a Marine infantryman. Those are like kind of at the top of the list of the most horrific experiences to go through in war, sort of, in my opinion, at least in contemporary terms.
Yeah, and I mean, that's well put, Sayre. I don't want to, you know, short shrift the guys who were in the ETO by saying, oh yeah, I totally agree with you. But, you know, I can tell you this. I mean, my father and I talked about that very thing many times, because his older brother, my uncle, was in the 741st Tank Battalion in Europe, landed at D-Day. He was a platoon commander, Sherman Tank platoon commander, and was an officer. He had graduated from the Citadel and fought through going into Germany, into Czechoslovakia in 45, and had 3 Purple Hearts, a Bronze Star, and a Silver Star. He won a bronze, it was Silver Star on D-Day, and then a Bronze Star up in Wallershad on the north shoulder of the Bulge. And so you have a complete juxtaposition of the World War II experience between Eugene Sledge and his older brother, Edward Sledge. So I have a tremendous amount of respect for what the guys went through on the European front. But I know my dad telling me, I never knew my grandfather. Okay, my grandfather had been a doctor in the Army in World War I, and was very well portrayed in the Pacific miniseries, I thought. But I remember my dad and I talking about when he came home and trying to mentally convalesce and get himself back together and put the war experience behind him and get ready to prepare himself for life after the war. And my grandfather, his dad, was a tremendous help to him in that regard. And one of the things my grandfather told him was that, look, what you went through was probably one of the most horrific things, other than someone who was a POW of the Japanese. What you went through probably eclipsed, and I'm not saying this to piss off anybody who's been through heavy combat, but just telling you what he said. My grandfather told him, what you went through probably eclipsed anything that anybody else went through, other than guys who were POWs of the Japanese, but you made it home. Don't feel sorry for yourself. You've got your eyes, your ears, your arms, your legs, your sanity. Do not feel sorry for yourself. Move on with your life.
It's almost like 2 different wars. They happened at the same time, but when you really dig into it, it was different equipment. in a sense.
Mhm.
Different, I mean, at the lowest level, the same equipment, but if you're talking about aircraft carriers versus tanks and LSTs and different equipment, different tactics, you've got major movements across land and giant convoys moving equipment across Europe versus island hopping and it different enemies, different tactics. I think it's easy to group them together as World War II, but it's okay to say these are really two totally different wars being fought.
Yeah, completely disparate. I mean, I know my father had a tremendous, because again, he had a tremendous amount of historical knowledge. He inculcated that in my brother and me, encouraged us to read, which, as I've told you guys, I from a very early age had a strong interest in World War II history. And it wasn't just the Pacific. I was really interested in the Germans and what happened in Europe, knowing, of course, what my uncle had been through and his experience in the 741st Tank Battalion. And that was, I would ask my father questions about different things. And, he had a tremendous amount of respect for the German army. And he said, they were fine soldiers, but at the end of the day, they would call a halt and bed down and rest and then pick it up the next day. And he said, the Japanese didn't do that.
Yeah.
I mean, they were moving around at night, infiltrating, which is pretty well known now, and were horrifically effective at it.
It's a different level of fanaticism, that they were fighting with the Japanese. It's like the boogeyman out there. I'm sure it's the boogeyman when, like, being in Bastogne, like the Germans are just across the forest. They're on the other side. That would be scary, of course.
Right.
But then also, I just think that there's that element of the night movements and the fanaticism of the Japanese boogeyman coming to get you, because they're both coming to get you,
Right.
and you don't. And on the other side of that, when you're 19 or 20 and you just want to be home watching movies and stuff, hanging out at the end of the day. And
exactly.
But you're dealing in this situation. I mean, I do think that there's a big distinction with that Japanese boogeyman and and then even being captured and stuff, like you mentioned, like the worst experience being like the POWs, and to know what would happen to that if you were taken alive as well, which really means you got to fight to the death at this point. Like we're here to die almost, because they're here to die. And
Exactly.
we're on their land and they're defending it. It's like to have to deal with all that and that constant pressure of having to go and always be on edge and always be at that front tip of the spear. I don't know how you come back, by the way, and just put that in the back of your head either.
Exactly. Well, my dad got in theater early 44, and then was his first combat was Peleliu, September 44. And by then we as in the United States and the Allies in toto, we knew that the Japanese were a ruthless enemy. You did not want to be taken prisoner because we had behind us the experience of Guadalcanal, the famed Getgi Patrol, which was a humanitarian mission by Colonel Frank Getli. I think it was Lieutenant Colonel Getgi, who was a 1st Marine Division. I can't remember which regiment he was in, but he was the intelligence officer and was told that down near the Matanikaw, there was a group of Japanese who wanted to surrender. And this was early in the campaign, early in the war against Japan. Okay, so he put together a patrol and was enthusiastically going to go down and bring them in. And long story short, they were butchered. They were ambushed and butchered. And that story, the Getgi Patrol, became lore within the Marine Corps. And so to skip ahead to 1944, when my dad gets into the mix, all that kind of thing was well known. And so take no prisoners, do not allow yourself to be taken prisoner. That was endemically understood at that point.
Mm-hmm.
It seems like there's this line between respect and hatred of an enemy. And you definitely need to maintain some level of respect, but it feels like in the Pacific theater that trended much more towards hatred. You think that's accurate to say?
I do, because there were times, and this is in his book, and then I've seen it where he wrote of it more in his unpublished work. They would see Marine dead who had been butchered and mutilated, and the Japanese would do, and this happened on Guadalcanal too. It wasn't just Peleliu. It wasn't just my father's experience to see this, but the Japanese had done some pretty horrific things to the corpses of Marine dead. And it's pretty tough to see that and not begin to feel a seething hatred, as if there weren't enough reasons for it already, you know.
I've heard I think it was Dan Carlin had an analysis of that in one of his recent podcasts, where it was that idea of mutilating the body and leaving it behind. I guess the idea is to scare the enemy. Like, don't listen, this is what we're capable of. But it seems like in almost every case it has the opposite effect. And it just drives a feeling of revenge and take no prisoners. So I don't know. Germany did a lot of that too in World War I and World War II, where they would,
Sure.
Mass punishments, maybe,
Mhm.
a little bit of resistance in a village and they burn the whole thing down, and it just didn't work.
It galvanizes people.
Yeah.
And I love that you mentioned Dan Carlin, because Dan and I have actually been emailing back and forth. I reached out to him because his Supernova in the East,
Yeah.
hardcore history, he mentions my dad so many times. And I'm listening to it, and it blew me away. And he starts talking about Eugene Sledge. I love this way, and he starts quoting from him. Well, I'm actually listening to the Supernova in the East episode for the second time, and I sent him a message. I thought in a million to one shot he's going to respond. And I said, "Hey man, I'm Eugene Sledge's son. I just want to tell you I love what you said about my dad, and I love your work." And he sends me this really nice email back, and so we've emailed back and forth a couple of times. But yeah, I mean, those types of things, and look, you're talking about a bunch of guys who are 18, 19, 20 years old. They're in the full bloom of youth, the vigor of the vitality of youth. They're still growing up, really, in a lot of ways. And they form tremendous bonds of loyalty to each other, which is kind of fostered by the entire military training process. I remember my dad talking about being on Pavuvu. It was like they were deprived of everything. I mean, they didn't have, they had food, but it wasn't great food. Their Pavuvu was not a very civilized island in any shape, form, or fashion, and had been picked out for that very reason to be the staging area for the 1st Marine Division. After the guys came off Guadalcanal, they went to Melbourne, Australia, and then after my dad gets into theater at that point, that his first introduction is to, after he landed at New Caledonia, to as part of a replacement, he's then advanced infantry training, and then they go up north to Pavuvu, and that's where he joins K Company 3rd Battalion 5th Marines, K35. And those guys had been there after Cape Gloucester, so they're all pissed off about, well, we didn't get to go to Melbourne. This kind of sucks. But, I remember my dad really kind of joking about the fact that he felt like it was part of the process that the, strategic planners wanted to get them as angry and pissed off as they could get them by depriving them of so many things. Because number one, it would make them mad and ready to kill the enemy, because the enemy is the whole reason they were out there to begin with. And number two, it fostered those bonds of comradeship, which you guys understand because you're veterans, So you go through tough times with your buddies, you become even more bonded to your buddies.
It's funny you say that, because we had one of our old squad leaders from Afghanistan was a private during the invasion of Iraq. And a part of that was he went to the desert in like September. So we invaded Iraq in March.
Mm-hmm.
So, but that's what he said. He said, I think they did this on purpose just to make us salty and pissed off, because they made them do all these training events. They isolated them. They were living out of their rucksacks. They did have showers. And then before the invasion, regular other units came and took all those sort of facilities away from them. So they were just eating out of their rucks, living out of their rucks off in the desert, to where they were itching to go to Baghdad by the time they got the order, because they had to get the hell out of there and just, and fight. So it's just funny that you say that, because he literally told the same story as someone on the front lines of like the invasion of Iraq.
Mm-hmm. I think it makes sense.
I don't know if you guys have heard this one. I can't imagine there's logic behind it, but the landing craft, the Higgins boats, were flat bottomed, so they'd bounce a little bit, and the longer guys sat in them, they'd start vomiting and get seasick. And there was I guess a joke. I'll leave it as a joke. that they made the soldiers and Marines so sick in those landing craft that they wanted to get ashore. Like nobody else wants to get ashore on an invasion, but when you're riding around in that craft for an hour or two at a time, all of a sudden hitting the beach seems like a good idea. So same idea, I guess. Can't imagine that was on purpose.
Yeah, it could be. I mean, I know when my dad was going through his amphibious training, you know, they were doing amphibious exercises in the islands around Pavuvu, which is, you know, just north of the Solomon, technically part of the Solomon Islands. It's about 60 miles north of Guadalcanal. And there were, you know, a lot of outlying islands. And so they're doing amphibious exercises all the time. And they're doing them from LCVPs, you know, landing craft vehicle personnel, also known as the Higgins boat. And of course, you know, when you got into the Central Pacific where the islands were atolls and had the coral reefs, well, then you got to have the LVTs, you know, the landing vehicle track, also known as amphibious tractors. But seasickness is funny because that was just something my dad never suffered from. And I remember him telling me that he said, man, some of the guys, we'd be in a Higgins boat or an Amtrak on a landing exercise, and like Snafu, his best friend, you know, slightest bit of motion, the guys have to move apart so Snafu could lie down because he would just become violently seasick.
So you've made it out there before, right? To at least Peleliu. I mean, you got the hat on now. Peleliu.
Yeah,
some of these other sites.
You know, growing up, it had always been my dream to go to Peleliu because there was something about the idea of this. I knew it was a sparsely populated island. I knew even before I really started researching the battle, I knew that the detritus of war was everywhere. Rusted out tanks, rusted out landing craft, you know, carcasses of planes here and there. And that fascinated me to go to a jungle environment that was still such a preserved battlefield. You know, my dad's book was published when I was 15, 16. So of course I read it immediately and then had read it more through the years. Well, in 1999, I got the opportunity. My father and my dad was still alive then. He passed away in 2001. A flyer came in the mail from Military Historical Tours, and it was putting together a 55th anniversary return trip to Peleliu. So, you know, 1944 to 1999. So I had gone down to my parents' house to visit them because I lived in Hoover, as a matter of fact, at that time. And my dad, he said, hey, look, this came in the mail. I know you talked about wanting to go to Peleliu. So I looked at it and I was immediately like, hell yeah, man, I got to do this. And so I registered, I contacted the people who were putting the tour together. They were immensely excited because even in 1999, now this was pre the Pacific, which was 2010, pre the war by Ken Burns, which was 2007. You know, they see the last name Sledge and they were tremendously excited to see that. And so a Marine officer called me and told me how excited he was to have me on the trip. And he said, you know, we would love it if your father would come and we would happily offer him an all expense paid trip if he would like to join us. And of course, I'm thinking it'd be great if he'd give me an all expense paid trip, but it didn't quite work out that way. But I said, well, okay, I think I know what he's going to say, but I'll ask him. So I did. And, you know, my dad had a very dry sense of humor. And he said, you tell them I've already had an all expense paid trip to Peleliu, so no thanks.
There we go.
But he, you know, he thought it was cool that I wanted to go. And so I did it. And I started out with the Military Historical Tour group. Just getting there is an exercise unto itself. We flew, me being here in Birmingham, I went to LA, spent the night, met up with the tour group, and then we flew to Honolulu, got on another plane, flew from there to Guam, and then got on another plane and flew from Guam into the Palau Islands. And you don't actually fly to Peleliu, you fly to one of the northern Palau Islands, which was Battlegrounds. That's where the actual airfield is for people coming into the Palau Islands. Spent the night there, actually on Koror, which is adjoining Battlegrounds, and then got on a boat. It was about an hour boat ride south to Peleliu. And then on Peleliu, I met up with some guys, and I had actually corresponded with them. Some guys who had been there several times before. One guy named Eric Maylander, who had been there 6 or 7 times, and he had corresponded with my dad. And there were some specific things that we were going to look for involving my dad's unit, some specific sites. But you know, and it was in September of '99, so obviously an anniversary tour. The weather was similar to what it had been like in 1944, but it probably wasn't as hot. It was very humid and it was hot, but it wasn't 115 degrees because, you know, in 1944, obviously the island was almost completely denuded of vegetation from the pre-landing bombardment. So that's the beginning of how I got to Peleliu.
That's a bucket list trip for me. There's a lot, but that's one of them. And it's intimidating when I look into it because it takes so much effort to get there. I feel like I'm not ready. Like, I don't know there's an imaginary line I have, like to go visit Shiloh battlefield is 3 hours away. I'll go tomorrow. And if I miss something, then I'll go back next week. But Peleliu seems like I might get there once. I want to make sure I'm so ready and I know exactly what I'm looking for. And that's awesome. What did it meet expectations? Was it drastically different than what you thought?
Oh, it met and surpassed expectations, because one of the things, and I know it's been a while since you've read my dad's book, but there was an adjoining island to Peleliu, and by adjoining, I'm talking about like 300 yards or maybe even 200 yards across the channel from the northern tip of Peleliu, called Ingusibus. Okay, well, 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines assaulted Ingusibus on D+13, 13 days into the battle. And the reason for that, it was twofold. Number one, because there was a small airfield there, so they wanted to neutralize that. And then number two, to prevent a possible offloading site for Japanese reinforcements coming down from the northern Palau Islands. And so they accomplished that by taking Ingusibus. But some of the most compelling stories my dad told in his book happened on Ingusibus. They got into a firefight, which they depicted in the Pacific miniseries. They got into a firefight with a Japanese bunker, ended up killing like 17 Japanese soldiers in it. And Eric Maylander, my friend who had done heavy research and had been to Peleliu like 6 times previously, we were able to find that bunker. And Ingusibus is completely uninhabited. You know, it's very small too. Even smaller than Peleliu. Peleliu is 6 miles long by 2 miles wide. Okay,
Tiny.
And tiny. You know, especially if you're used to studying World War II in the context of European battlefields. But yeah, going over to Ingusibus, we found that bunker. My dad writes about a part where when they realized there were Japanese in there and they start throwing grenades, dumping grenades down in the ventilator shaft of the bunker, and the Japanese, they can hear them talking to each other and jabbering amongst themselves. And so, you know, my dad looks like he's crouched by a wall, a little concrete embankment at one end of this bunker, and he looks over the edge of it, and there's a Japanese soldier with a machine gun who lets off about a 7-round burst. That, you know, my dad, the way he wrote about it, he pulled his head down so fast that his helmet literally came off his head, you know, as this round of, I don't think it was a Nambu, it was actually a Lewis gun, which was a smaller Japanese machine gun that they used in the rear cockpits of their observation planes, like the F-1M2 you know, it would have been one of those, but that's what the machine gun actually was. But you know, my dad wrote about it. He looks over and the Japanese gunner's just looking up at him and then just looses a burst. And my dad jerks his head down and, you know, and I was able to kneel in that exact spot. I've got a lot of pictures of it.
Oh, wow.
That was a cool thing. And, you know, with my dad still being alive at that time, and he knew from corresponding with Eric Maylander previously, and then from me being versed on what we wanted to accomplish on the trip, he knew that we were going to look for that bunker. It had not been found in previous trips. And so at the end of that day, we went back across to the channel to Peleliu. And of course, in 1999, you know, we didn't have smartphones. You know, there wasn't the internet that was, I mean, there was the internet, but not to the degree that we have it now. But I was able, they did have a telephone on Peleliu, and I was able to call my dad. Of course, it was, you know, late afternoon where we were, and it was like 2 o'clock the previous morning where he was.
Yeah.
But, you know, I was able to say, hey, you know, we found the bunker, you know, just wanted to tell you that. And I'm really proud to be your son. And, you know, it was kind of cool to be able to do that. But
Dang, that's awesome.
It's incredible, yeah, to have that experience and that it's still there. I mean,
yeah, it's been visited by, you know, I haven't been back to Peleliu since then, and I want to go back. I want to take my wife and my son, but, you know, the trips to Peleliu, I mean, people go there all the time, certainly probably even more so since the Pacific miniseries, but that is kind of an iconic site now, you know, among people who know the history of the battle.
sure. I mean, and the people going there, you know that they've read your dad's book. For someone to take all that energy and effort to go to Peleliu, I mean, that's the reason why, I would imagine, is your dad's book itself.
Oh yeah, I mean, that's a big part of it. You know, if you look, I know this is people listening aren't gonna be able to see this, but that is my dad's K-bar mounted on the wall there, and then below that is a Japanese bayonet that he took out off a dead Japanese soldier out of that bunker after they neutralized.
Wow.
But all the bunkers that we saw, and that one too, you know, it was the same procedure to eliminate them. They all that we could see, and of course they're all overgrown with jungle now in 1999. But you know, they were obviously heavily reinforced because you could see the rebar. But in the walls of these things, they all had holes, and the holes were all charred black. And they all had holes because what the Marines would do is call in either an M4 Sherman tank or an armored LVT and fire a couple of 75 millimeter rounds at point blank range into them, and then have a flamethrower come up and douse it with a flamethrower.
And then Marines would come in after that, then Marines kind of sweep it clear.
Well, like in the case of the one that we've been talking about, I mean, when they realized that, hey, there's not just 1 or 2 Japanese soldiers in this thing, there's a whole bunch of them, and we've got them bottled up. That's when they sent somebody back to, it was actually RV Bergen, the NCO, who said, or the squad leader, who said, you guys wait here, I'm going to go back for help. And he ran back about 100 yards or so and found an armored amphibious tractor. And that thing came up and took up a line pretty close, you know, within 20 yards of the bunker, and fired 3 75 mil shells into it. And, you know, again, beautifully written, if one can say that, describing such an event, but beautifully written and with the old breed. But when the dust settled from, and my dad and all his buddies are lined up there with their carbines and Tommy guns, you know, at high port ready to go. And as the dust clears from that last 75 mil shell, a Japanese soldier appears in the opening, and like right line of sight to my dad, 20 yards away. And my dad gets his carbine up and just starts squeezing all shots into his chest. And when the Japanese soldier appeared, he had a grenade and he was trying to activate it. And the Japanese grenades had a percussion activation fuse on it. And the way that they would pull a string, and that it had this button on the top that they would either hit it on a boulder, the stock of their rifle, or their helmet. And that doing that would activate the process, which within a few seconds it would explode. And so, you know, he described, and I've heard it described by other veterans too, when you heard that tapping sound, you knew a Japanese soldier was trying to activate a grenade to get ready to throw it. But this guy is trying to activate a grenade and get ready to throw it. And then of course, my dad, not point blank, but very close to that, starts squeezing off rounds, and then they all started shooting him too, but he collapses and the grenade goes off at his feet, you know, and then I think within a few seconds of that, they got the flamethrower guy up there to hose it down with a flamethrower. And that guy was actually named Womack. He was from Mississippi.
This is to give some perspective of people, the size of that fight there. Would you say 6 miles by 2 miles?
Peleliu was 6 miles by 2 miles, and Anguisebus was a little bit smaller.
So Normandy, for reference, was a 50-mile front, 50. From one beach, from Utah down to Gold, Juno Sword, past 50 miles. And if you add in where the paratroopers jumped, roughly 4 to 5 miles inland. So 50 miles by 5 miles, just the Normandy beach, 6 miles by 2 miles for Peleliu. It's like a cage fight. And those guys on Normandy could pull back. The German defenses there could pull back and reinforce and regroup. On Peleliu, that's it. What's there, that's what you're fighting with.
I think what's also interesting is, like, compared to Normandy or whatever, in Europe theater is like, it makes sense in the way that, like, Normandy, hey, we got to get to mainland Europe, we got to land somewhere, and then we're going to go west to east until we can go conquer the capital, right? Get to Berlin. Right. Logical, makes sense, right? In traditional thinking. But then here you have, and again, these are all just people, individuals making decisions, very few people making decisions that the consequences are very vast for the individuals on the ground who actually have to do the job. And, but then in the Pacific, you just have like this 12 square foot mile island in the middle of pretty much nowhere, no resources really. And it's like, but this is the stand. This is where we're going to have our stand. We're going to take this hill. We're going to mass all the troops. And, you know, those decisions were made by the Japanese that they're going to hold it to the last. And then you got the decisions by the Americans saying, well, we're going to fight that position to the last. And this is where we're going to do it. And they did do it, obviously. And it's just, to me, it's fascinating that the Pacific itself, where they wanted to call their shots and all these different islands. And I know that there's a big why and it fits into the bigger picture, but the mass violence that was there. And again, maybe that's why I do put it in the same perspective as I would the trench in World War I, because it's the same thing. You have, okay, this is where the last stand is going to be. You guys are going to be in this line in the dirt, and then you guys are going to be in this line in dirt. Ready, go.
I know my father used the expression that it was like two scorpions in a bottle at Peleliu.
Yeah.
You know, and as you described, the fighting in Europe, there was a geographical symmetry. You know, like you said, you land in Normandy. Basically, you go west to east. I mean, obviously, it was more complicated than that, but you go west to east, and you're eventually trying to get to Berlin. And then, like they said in Saving Private Ryan, you get that big boat ride home.
Mm-hmm.
You know, the Pacific was so geographically disparate. It was so spread out. It was so vast. And that kind of invites the broader question from the strategic standpoint of, why did they even need to be at Peleliu? And that's a whole separate conversation, but it is certainly relevant because, you know, the reason at the time, the reason was believed. I mean, we were by late 44, we were pursuing a two-prong, and I'm vastly simplifying this. We were pursuing a two-prong strategy going through the Pacific, Nimitz and the Navy going through the Central Pacific, you know, the Gilberts, the Marshalls, the Marianas, Southwestern Pacific Drive by Macarthur, with his ultimate sacrosanct goal being the Philippines, to return to the Philippines. It was determined that Peleliu was required because it did have a very large airfield. The Japanese did have a very large Naval Air Force presence there. We needed to neutralize that airfield to protect MacArthur's right flank as he advanced on the Philippines. The sad thing is, prior to the Marines hitting Peleliu, there had been numerous U.S. Navy task force raids going through there with Bull Halsey, and the aviators were coming back saying, we're not really seeing much Japanese air resistance. I mean, they knocked out a ton of it on the ground because of the remains of a lot of those airplanes were on Peleliu, but air to air, the naval aviators by, you know, mid to late 44 weren't seeing that much around the Palau Islands. And so Halsey actually recommended, and we're really getting broad here, and I know we want to keep a more, you know, microscopic approach.
This is good. No, broad is good, I think.
Okay. It was, Halsey actually said, I'm not sure we really need to invade Peleliu. I mean, because, and in fact, because late October, I think October 20th of 44, MacArthur actually went ashore in the Philippines. And so my dad and his buddies are just coming off the front lines of Peleliu. And they're like, what are we even doing here? We thought, and I'm really oversimplifying this, but I know on the troop ship after the battle, when my dad and his buddies are headed back to Pavuvu to rest and refit and start training for the next operation, which for them was going to be Okinawa in April 45. one of my dad's buddies is like, Sledgehammer, why the hell did we even take Peleliu? I mean, we lost so many good buddies there for what? MacArthur's already in the Philippines now, and we were supposed to protect his flank to make that easier, but he did it while we were still at Peleliu. And, you know, once the Marines left Peleliu in late October 44, the Army, the 81st Infantry Division, was there for another 6 weeks because there were so many Japanese deeply embedded in the cave system in the northern part of the island.
So what Henry's getting at there, for anyone who doesn't know, is not every island in the Pacific that had Japanese soldiers on it was assaulted. There were a lot of islands. In fact, more islands, I think, were bypassed than attacked. So the Iwo Jimas, Okinawa, Guadalcanal, Cape, like that's the minority of islands. They were very strategic locations chosen for various reasons. There weren't the resources, the manpower, and it didn't make sense to just go to every single island and kill every Japanese soldier there. You could cut them off. And there's stories of, I think Rabaul is one where the Allies—
Rabaul is a great example.
We're just going to go around and just left them to wither on the vine. So that was an option, and it had been done before. But yeah, it gets tricky. So they were already talking about that shortly after the fight. I was convinced, I had in my mind that was an armchair quarterback 50 years after kind of thing.
I think there was a realization that MacArthur's timetable had been moved up, and he did go ashore. He did do his famous, return walking ashore. I don't want to say the exact date because I don't want to misremember, but if my dad and his buddies were not off Peleliu yet, then it was very close to that.
Sure.
I think it's the age-old thing where you got, for one, these are Marines, and you have the doers being ordered by the people in the man in the high castle, the officers, right, and the people who are not going to go do the job. So I think you're always going to have a little bit of a conflict there. And then it probably is a little interesting when it's also an Army general. You're a Marine, you're a young Marine, you're listening to the Army telling you what to do. You probably resent that a little bit, I would think. Just kind of being in that role at that time and the aggression and the mindset, especially after going through something like that, I could definitely see some saltiness going on.
Definitely some inter-service rivalry. There's been the expression that I've seen this used in history books that MacArthur referred to some Marine outfits as, MacArthur's Marines, because, the 1st Marine Division before Peleliu was used to obviously they were at Guadalcanal, a seminal battle for them and other units and Army units as well, but they assaulted Cape Gloucester in December 43. And then it was right after that my dad got to Pavuvu. But the 1st Marine Division has been referred to by some historians as MacArthur's Marines. And, I remember growing up, if you wanted to piss my dad off, use that expression to him.
There you go.
He was like, whatever. He wasn't a big MacArthur fan, but
sure,
he was entitled to his opinion.
But it is the conflict of it's the balance of the person on the ground is experiencing reality. On the front lines is actually what is happening, and what, because before that, all you had was intelligence telling the story. You've got strategists thinking of how it is and what the plan is going to be. And sometimes that's correct, but it's never 100% accurate, right? It normally goes wrong as soon as you leave the wire or as soon as you land, I'm sure, on the island, it just all goes to crap. And so you have the individual who's perceiving real-time war as it's happening. And sometimes that gets communicated very well from bottom up, because that's where it starts, is bottom up at the 18, 19-year-old private level. The eyeballs on the very, very front line at the very, very tip of the spear. And so sometimes that gets listened to from the bottom up and it gets refined. But then other times it's just, unfortunately, it's not, that's just, you're taking that hill. And it's hard to tell when are you taking the hill. It's like the line between arbitrary and necessary. It's a very tough thing to figure out. And then I think that the ultimate challenge is, they have no say in any of this, right? They have to do all of it. They are these young men in this foreign land, and they land and everybody's trying to kill them.
A great example of what you're talking about, Sayre, is Peleliu, because it was famously predicted to be rough but fast. 4 days, maybe 3. That's what the guys were told when they were in their LSTs and troop ships going from Pavuvu to the Palau Islands. And you had guys, my dad had conversations with buddies who had been at Cape Gloucester, been at Guadalcanal, and they're like, man, 3 or 4 days, I can take anything for 3 or 4 days, do that standing on my head. And sadly, as history revealed, Peleliu was much more complicated than that, and a lot of that was because of the nature of the terrain. I mean, the multi-ridge complex known as Bloody Nose Ridge collectively, but known by the locals as the Brogel, on the northern part of the island, where the Japanese were able to dig in and fortify so many caves. I mean, I think that I've seen the number 500 to 600 caves interconnected by tunnels, some reinforced by steel doors. But yeah, that's it speaks to that point.
Another little interesting piece with this fight is, the limited resource of reporters and media personnel. Macarthur was reporting to the Philippines. That was the story, right? That was the narrative. That was the big thing. So a lot of people went there. Why not? Who's going to miss that against this little 3-day fight that probably won't take very long? So there's a lot of photos and things that we don't have from the first, at least few weeks.
That's a great point, Preston, because that very thing right there, because of the prediction that Peleliu would be rough but fast and over so quick, of all the war correspondents who were on the troop ships standing off from the island, most of them did not go ashore because they thought, well, it's going to be a walkover. What's the point? A few did, but many of them did not. And my father did write about that a lot of the true nature of what was going on certainly was understood later, but maybe not as quickly as it could have been understood because so many correspondents did not go ashore at first.
Do we know, because propaganda fits into this too, especially, all governments do it. And I wonder, that's not the message, those type of horrific events is not something that I think we should portray because it's real and it's authentic. And that is what's happening to Americans on the ground. But I would think in that time, in our history, that type of story doesn't want to be told. We want to show success. We want to show, we're stomping through and tearing, the 3-day, almost you'd want to think that they would want to be there if we did just walk over top everybody. We don't want to show heavy resistance and that sort of thing. But I don't know. I just don't, and your dad wouldn't know either because he was off in the war. I am curious as to what was being told to the American John Q. public at that time when your dad was in that reality. What's everybody else being told back home of what's going on, especially if the correspondents are not where the action is, or if they're on the boat and they're taking it from second and third hand accounts. Even though they're close in proximity, they're still not physically there. And they're being, I think, somewhat regulated by the government at that time. I think that is being tailored.
Well, that brings up a great point in and of itself, because the sad thing about Peleliu was they weren't being told much of anything for so long. And this was something that was very frustrating and probably heartbreaking to my dad, because he keenly felt the loss of so many good buddies, so many fellow Marines, and the soldiers lost a lot there too. The 81st Infantry Division, Army had casualties there too. It wasn't just a Marine show. But Peleliu, when I was growing up in the 70s, 80s, was known as the forgotten battle. I would posit now, after with the old breed having been around for 40 years now, I guess, and other books that have been written, Ken Burns' The War being made in 2007, certainly the Pacific miniseries, I would posit now that Peleliu, while certainly not maybe a household name like Iwo Jima, I would say that it is one of the better known battles.
100%. Tier 2, if you will, in common knowledge of the Pacific, I'd say. Yeah. Well, Fortunately, we didn't have those reporters going ashore to get the firsthand accounts, but people like your father did write that stuff down and passed it along to where not just within your family. It would have been impressive if he wrote it down and just kept it personal for you all to read. But the fact that he published it and we can read it is awesome. Henry, we're going to start wrapping up here. Are there put you on the spot here, any books you recommend on the Pacific theater in general, whether you've read them of late or just what are your go-tos when someone asks that question?
There's a great book by Colonel Joseph Alexander called Storm Landings. Joe Alexander was a Marine colonel. He was an amphibious, I think it was an amphibious battalion commander in Vietnam. But very, very astute historian. He was on the Peleliu trip with me in 1999. We became very good friends. He was a good friend of my father's. I actually named my son after him. But Joe Alexander, anything by him, but Storm Landings is not a terribly long book, and it is about a collection of the amphibious battles, Saipan, Tinian, Guam, Peleliu, Okinawa, that describe the direct frontal amphibious assaults into the teeth of very fortified Japanese positions. Okay, so something like Guadalcanal or Cape Gloucester won't be in that, but that's a great book. It's not terribly long. It really encapsulates a lot of action in the Pacific War. Another one that I actually just reread it, is Robert Leckey's Strong Men Armed, because that is, and it's primarily writing from the Marine point of view, obviously, because he was a Marine, but it's described Strong Men Armed. I mean, seeing that book on the shelf, on my dad's bookshelf growing up, it's, I think does a great job of describing so many of the iconic battles of the Pacific War. So I would say those two right off the bat, and then my dad's second book, China Marine, which was when the original manuscript was going to be published, his original manuscript covered his entire experience in the war, which after Okinawa was North China occupation duty. And they ended up saying, oh, this thing's too long. Let's cut that part out and make it a separate book. And I'm really oversimplifying, but China Marine came out. It was really published posthumously in 2001, but it's very short, but it describes his time in China and then coming home and getting back into post-war life, the beginning of that. So that would be another one.
That's interesting. I didn't know about that one. I'm interested in that. I'll throw out Flyboys by James Bradley. I read that. That's the guy that wrote Flags of Our Fathers.
Yes.
His dad was the one who maybe raised the flag in Iwo Jima. That's a little confusing now, but
right.
Flyboys, I probably was like 18 or 19 when I read that. That was a deep education for me, talking about what you were describing about the POW treatment. And a lot of it is like Nanking and sort of the Japanese Imperial Army at that time. And what a lot of the naval aviators that were shot down in the Pacific and that were captured and taken prisoner. And George Bush was one of the guys that was shot down in this time period, and a sub happened to raise up and find him. But anyway, that for me personally was a really excellent book of help setting that scene and time frame at that region.
Flyboys is a tough read. I remember when I say Joe, I'm talking about Colonel Alexander. James Bradley had talked to him in the process of writing Flyboys. I read Flyboys many years ago, and it is a tough read because it deals with some horrific POW issues. Anyway, that for me, well, those two, your dad's book and Flyboys, I think for me personally, those are my main source of education on this experience. One from a son of the veteran, think about that, James Bradley. And then one by the actual doer. And they're just important stories. And it was kind of go back to what you were saying, I think, of like, it's that line of like, because you're talking about the other parents who sort of stayed quiet, and you understand that sort of sentiment versus your dad who was more open with the dialogue. And I think it is more awkward to be open about it. In a lot of ways, I think that just being quiet and keeping to yourself is kind of easy in a sense. Sure. And I will plug another book that's going to be coming out September, October. It's going to be called Devil Dogs by Saul David, British military history professor. And Saul wrote this book about K-35, but it covers, the cool thing about it is it covers K-35 through the panoply of the Pacific War, going back to Guadalcanal. And, you know, of course, books like Helmet for My Pillow, Robert Leckie was in the 1st Marines. So this is interesting to see what the 5th Marines were doing at that point in time. So yeah, Devil Dogs is, and Saul had me read the manuscript and you know, as the son of Sledgehammer and make suggestions. And so that's going to be coming out August, September. So I think that's
Awesome.
Based on what I read, that's going to be really good.
Keep an eye out. Well, Henry, thank you very much for taking the time. It was nice meeting you a few weeks ago. Great talking today, and looking forward to staying in touch, sir.
Yeah, it's been an absolute pleasure.
Yeah,
All right, take
really
care.
appreciate it.